Oi, Priscila, tudo bem?
Oi, querida, já vou tirar o som aqui, que eu tô no trem.
Tá. Aqui, tá ao vivo no YouTube, tá?
Você tá falando comigo? Fala.
Olá, olá. Cadê a gente?
Ai, gente, eu não consigo tirar. Se usar o Zoom no celular. Eu vou ter que sair, eu vou voltar. Hi, Sarah.
Hello, Priscilla. Bom dia,
Oi.
Paula and Amanda.
Vocês me ouvem, Sarah?
vou ter que sair, eu vou voltar. Mas que droga.
Hi, Sarah.
Hello, hello. Hello, Paula. Hello, Amanda.
Hi.
Hi. Hello.
We are here.
Oi, todo mundo.
How are you, Sarah?
Very well, thank you. Hello, everybody. Hello.
Virtually, at least.
Hi, Sarah.
Hello, Priscilla.
Hi, how are you?
Just a second.
Very well, thank you. Hello, everybody.
Ah, there's a bit of a delay. Sounds like.
Hello, Priscilla.
Pode sair? Não, deixa eu gravar para editar.
Ah, there's a bit of a delay.
O quê? É a Priscila. Muta. Priscila, a gente vai te mutar, tá bom? Pronto. Ah, nice. We were with a noisy. It was Priscila. Good. Perfect. It's working.
Oh, good.
We wait.
Oi, eu vou.
Priscila, a gente vai te mutar, porque tá fazendo um mega barulho aqui. Priscila. Fica com delay.
Oh, good.
Oi, eu vou.
Priscila, a gente vai te mutar, viu? Tá fazendo um mega barulho aqui. Oi, just a second. Oi, voltou, né? Para as traduções. There's nothing showing on YouTube. Nothing showing. Some technical problems, just a sec. Será que é um problema de Some technical problems, just a sec. Taxa de pico da transição maior que a recomendada. Vai lá no Cadê? Será que aqui tem mais um? Aqui. Aí tá perfeito, tá vendo? Outra. É isso. I think we're good now. Tamo ótimo. Fica lá. It's working. Can you hear us properly now?
It's definitely better.
Okay. We were arranging what the resolution. And students, they are arriving, but you will not see everyone because they like to sit around.
Okay.
And some of them, they will see at YouTube. It could be open.
Okay.
So let's they seated. It's working on YouTube. It's working? Yes. Can we start?
Yeah.
They are getting closer.
Okay, great. Should I
Sarah.
try sharing my screen?
We are seeing you, not your screen. Try to. Did you prepare a PowerPoint?
Yes, I've got a PowerPoint. I'm just trying to share it now. Is it sharing?
Yes, it is, but it's not full presentation. Now it's perfect. Now it's perfect.
Okay, good.
So let's start. I will introduce you in Portuguese and then in English. A Sarah Charlton, ela é professora na Escola de Arquitetura e Planejamento de Witwatersrand. Demorei um século para falar. E ela coordena o CUBES, que é uma espécie de um laboratório que trabalha temas urbanos. Ela não fala nossa língua. Ela é uma professora tema, né? E ela nos recebeu, quando foi? Março. Então, março, abril desse ano, lá na Sul, com algumas lideranças, numa rede, que a gente está chamando de Lutas Urbanas Feministas. E esse projeto nos levou nas comunidades, levou em igrejas, vamos falar com igrejas de governo, tudo sobre as questões de moradia. Então, são lutas não só de moradia, mas em torno da água, em torno de serviços urbanos, em torno de urbano, equipamentos urbanos. E essas também são lutas políticas, né? Com 1000 desafios, né? E nessa visita, eu fui no Museu do Apartheid. O Museu do Apartheid começa a pensar que o Apartheid, uma das justificativas de colocar uma comunidade separada, era para resolver o problema das favelas. A motivação era urbana, né? E eu pedi para a Sarah vir e fazer uma aula para a gente que desse uma amarração. Então, ela vai falar um pouco do Apartheid, mas muito, vai falar das investigações atuais sobre o território e as relações entre essas coisas na África do Sul. Hoje ela está em Joanesburgo. Então, eu vou abrir aqui. Sarah, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. For us, it's a pleasure to have you here and to share with students. Here we have a class that is a discipline that it's mixed undergraduate students. And you start a block of international dialogues. So for us, it's very important to have you here. I will ask you to introduce yourself, first of all, and then start the presentation, please. And I started a little bit about in Portuguese, but you could share, please, English. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paula. I hope you can hear me clearly. I can't hear you that well unless you're sort of speaking towards me, but I'm hoping everyone in the class can hear. So good afternoon from South Africa. So I am Sarah Charlton, and I'm an associate professor in the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And I'm really pleased that Paula extended the invitation for me to speak this afternoon. It gives me great pleasure to talk about these issues, and I hope we might be able to have some useful conversation. My apologies that the entire presentation will be in English. And I hope Paula and Amanda and anyone else will speak whenever you need to speak, or stop me if I'm unclear or if I'm going too fast. Please feel free to do so. So I've got 3 parts to my presentation this afternoon. This afternoon for me, it's morning for you, I know. So the first part, I'm just going to give an introduction and an orientation to Johannesburg, to a little bit on the history of the city and some of the current dynamics in the city. The second part of the presentation, I'm going to focus on housing, and particularly low-income housing during apartheid, and then the post-apartheid approach to housing. And then the third part of the presentation, I'll take a specific gender lens on the post-apartheid housing story. And I've actually done 3 separate PowerPoints because I had very big file sizes with the images. So between each of those 3 parts, I'll just change to another PowerPoint. Paula and Amanda, I'm just checking that so far you can hear me. It's clear enough.
Yes, it's perfect. We muted ourselves, so we don't interrupt your presentation anyway. And if anyone has any doubts, they will raise their hands here, and I will unmute us. Okay?
Okay, that's perfect. Thanks. Thanks very much. Okay, so I'm starting with an artwork, and for me, partly what this encapsulates is the overall point or message of this afternoon's presentation. And I'm hoping to convey through the presentation something of the hugely emotional and political aspect of the housing story in South Africa. It's very fraught. It's very tied up with emotion and with politics. And I think that's to some extent true in many contexts, but it is definitely very true in the South African context. So that's one of the points I'm hoping to make this afternoon. The second one is to do with the very long reach of history, the continued relevance of apartheid and what happened during apartheid now, even 30 years after the end of apartheid. And that continues to shape policy around housing, and it continues to shape how people respond to the housing program of the state. The third point I'm hoping to make this afternoon is I think things require quite a nuanced examination. I think it's not so easy to say, to have a sort of binary perspective and to say it's all like this or it's all like that. I think it's really quite an entangled set of issues that are playing themselves out in housing. And I'm hoping to bring forward some of that complexity, and therefore the need to examine and explore the issues in quite a nuanced way, looking into some of the detail, exposing some of the contradictions, seeing the tensions in the story that defy a singular narrative of it. And then I also hope to make the point that a gendered lens on all of this is extremely productive. It's quite unexplored in the South African context. There are many dimensions to unpack and to analyze and to theorize. I'll just be focusing on one little angle this afternoon, but just to make the point of how significant it is. So back to the artwork on the screen. This was given to me by my friend Shireen Hassam, who's a gender specialist, in fact. She embroidered this image. And what is really significant is the text at the top, and that text says, "There shall be houses, security and comfort." And this is a key statement made in the 1950s and encapsulated in the Freedom Charter. And the Freedom Charter became the liberation movement's almost their Bible. It encapsulated their values and aspirations. And this phrase, "there shall be houses, security and comfort," from the Freedom Charter has translated all the way through into contemporary state programs. And so partly this makes the point of the long reach of history and the political dimensions of the story that I'm hoping to talk about. So to move into the first part of the presentation more properly. So this is the introduction and orientation to Johannesburg. I don't know how many people are familiar with Johannesburg. And I'm hoping you don't have a black bar over the top of your screen, but on the left-hand side of my picture is the image of South Africa, and Johannesburg is located in an entirely inland province. And here we have a blown up image of the metropolitan area of Johannesburg. But the point is that Johannesburg is adjacent to 2 other large metropolitan areas, Tshwane and Ekurhuleni. And the entire province is a very urbanized province. So altogether, the population of this urban conurbation is about 15.5 million people, although Johannesburg itself is more like 5 million people. It's really the economic powerhouse of the country. And the early days of Johannesburg's wealth is well known. It started as a gold mining city in the 1880s. And a lot of that gold mining is no longer active. And the source of Johannesburg's economic power now is much more to do with financial services, corporate headquarters, commerce and retail, some manufacturing. But the presence of the gold mining and the history of the gold mining is still highly significant. So Johannesburg's at the heartland of a 100-kilometer stretch of gold-bearing reef that stretches east-west on either side of the city. And there are a whole string of mining towns to the west of Johannesburg and to the east of Johannesburg that developed along this gold-bearing ore. Many of those towns have declined. The problem with the gold mining in South Africa is that the gold is incredibly deep under the city and under the reef, and it's a very expensive mining process. Some of the gold is 3.6 kilometers or 3.5 kilometers below the surface. But the city exists because of the gold mining, and some of these images are showing the actual mine dumps, the soil that gets excavated out of the mines and has given the city a lot of its character, and has in fact shaped some of the spatial configuration of the city. But basically the point is Johannesburg remains an economic powerhouse in the country. It contributes about 45% of the total economic output of the country, and although the gold mining is declining, there is a thriving set of activities of informal gold mining, and that's what I'm referring to in the bottom part of the slide where it says zama zamas. And basically this is an informal network of people who go down the closed off shafts and extract gold from the closed mines through very, very precarious, very dangerous mechanisms. And there's a lot of this happening under the city, all around the city. So this is not really the point of this afternoon's discussion at all, but I'm just trying to give you a little bit of a flavor of the city of Johannesburg. So on this map on the top left, the yellow dotted line is this gold mining, gold-bearing reef, where most of the gold is situated, and I said it extends 100 kilometers either side of the city. And very broadly, the more prosperous parts of the city are to the north. I've circled here the Johannesburg Central Business District, and then to the north of that, Sandton, which is a very upmarket kind of area. So roughly, the more prosperous and salubrious parts of the city are to the north, and the poorer parts of the city are to the south of that mining belt. And what that really shows is that the more dusty and windy parts of the city that were very unpleasant to live in when it was a very exposed mining town were the places where the poorer people ended up living to the south of the gold mining reef. And to the north, people were able to go over some small ridges, some small mountains, and enjoy the less dusty, better parts of the city. So one of the notorious things about Johannesburg and all of our South African cities is the way in which apartheid shaped the city, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But just to talk about the contemporary population density, here it's actually depicted as the province, the whole of Gauteng around Johannesburg. What is significant about this is the incredibly uneven form of population density in the city, and that's quite significant and quite unusual. And again, that's to do with the apartheid history. So you can see clusters of dense areas down to the southwest. This is Soweto, Alexandra is another old apartheid township. Those are the dense areas. The CBD has become quite dense, but they're really patches of very low density development in quite central parts of the city, and then some of these very high density areas on the periphery. So really quite an unusual sort of densification kind of map or gradient that again is very related to the apartheid history. Johannesburg itself is about 60 kilometers long, 30 kilometers wide, very roughly. I once heard it compared to Mexico City. It has much the same footprint as Mexico City, but it's much, much lower density. It's a sprawling city, very influenced by British town planning traditions and by the sort of American development of cities that were extremely kind of car-oriented. And so Johannesburg does display these, its heritage of separating land uses, so industrial in one area and residential in another area, big distances, very road and car-oriented layout. So since 1994, since the transition to democracy, there have been many efforts by government to change the apartheid spatial plans of South African cities through various policy initiatives and developments with various impacts, and I'll come back to that later. I think a lot of planners and geographers and urban development people in South Africa would say that probably to some considerable extent we failed. We have failed to change the apartheid spatial pattern very much. But again, I would say it's a difficult thing to analyze, and there's some very interesting trends that have happened despite what the state intended. So the state had all these policies and programs about how to change the apartheid city, and some of those have been moderately successful, some of them have failed, but other things have been happening that were not planned by government, and those themselves have shifted some of the issues that apartheid created. So there's quite an interesting sort of complexity between formal and informal processes playing themselves out. Johannesburg exhibits huge contrasts, I guess, like many cities in the global south, very stark contrasts of wealth and poverty. You'll know that we're very notorious for being one of the most unequal places in the world. We do have a lot of these flashy new lifestyle estate developments, as in the bottom right of the slide, coming up at the same time as many informal settlements. The top right is an example of an informal settlement. It looks like it's really far away from the city, and it is, but it's not that far from the edge of one bit of the city. And then the historic central business district, and a close-up of some of the shack settlements, which until very recently have often been of very provisional, precarious materials, these kind of shantytown sort of developments. One of the things to really bear in mind about South Africa and about Johannesburg is the enormous unemployment rate. It's really, really dramatic. And amongst particular demographic cohorts, it's particularly dramatic. So, for example, amongst young Black men, the unemployment rate will be in the early 60%, 62%, something like that. So that plays itself out in a whole lot of ways. There is, of course, quite a lot of informal economic activity as a response to people not being able to get a formal job. But again, it's a bit odd in the South African situation that there isn't more informal economic activity. So, I mean, I'm showing on the screen here some images of street vending and the sort of privatized public transport that's ubiquitous, that transports most people in the country, but is actually not subsidized by the state. It's an entirely private industry, these little vans that transport people everywhere. But in comparison to somewhere like India or other places where there's an enormous amount of home-based economic activity, other kinds of informal economic activity, and particularly small-scale manufacturing, South Africa does not actually exhibit much of that. We don't have much of that kind of economic activity. And it's part of the problem that we're facing in this country. And the explanation for that is the enormous reach and penetration of big business. Historically, big capital has penetrated almost every part of the economy in such a way that it's really difficult for people to do any kind of small-scale production that can compete in any way. So you won't get people making small bars of soap at home or those kinds of things, because even in a deep rural area, the big companies distribute their goods. Those are sold in small shops. The manufactured soap in a big factory is what will end up being cheaper than the one that you try and make at home. So this enormous dominance of big capital in the economy, coupled with enormous unemployment, creates really quite a stark situation in the country. Okay, so I am going to pause here, and I'm going to move on to part 2 of the presentation, which involves me just getting the next PowerPoint presentation. But maybe it's a chance if there's any explanation or questions or anything required while I do that.
I'd like to ask you, you said about the unemployment rates, that it was about 60% between young black men, and I'd like to know if this counts like informal economic activity, or 60% of the population that is not employed formally, or at all, like they're not taking part in any economic production or economic life.
Yeah, so I think I heard the question correctly. So what is being referred to is the formal definition of employment with those very high numbers. It's not really capturing at all the informal economic activity. It's really looking at formal jobs. So there is actually an issue that is debated in the country about what is being seen, what is being understood around economic activity, but those joblessness numbers, unemployment numbers, are to do with formal employment by a company. If I understood the question correctly. Shall I move on to the next part of the presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Great, good. So in this part of the presentation, I am focusing specifically on housing and the housing story under apartheid and post-apartheid. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that Johannesburg itself as a city started in 1886, late in 1800s with the discovery of gold. And urbanization into Johannesburg really picked up quite dramatically in the latter part of the 19th century and into the early part of the 20th century because of labor recruitment to service the mines and associated things that were starting to develop, associated services, but also various kinds of activities that made Black rural life quite difficult. Black people were increasingly sort of pulled into the capitalist and monetized economy through having to pay taxes, etc. There was some dispossession of land. And so people were increasingly required to try and eke out some kind of existence in an urban area. And what happened in the early part of the 1900s in Johannesburg is a lot of quite informal and quite congested settlement. And there were subsequently some health outbreaks. Outbreaks of bubonic plague was one of them. And those were used to then start clearances of people out of the city, clearing these kind of shanty areas which were close to the central part of where the mining activity was happening. And in fact, the early parts of Soweto were then the result of some of these displacements in the early part of the 20th century. So really, Black people were increasingly regarded only as labor for white capital in urban areas, and home ownership by Black people was effectively prohibited in 1923 through the Native Urban Areas Act. People's ability to really get a foothold in the city became increasingly constrained with subsequent pieces of legislation as well as practices. At the same time as this kind of thing was happening, there were also modernist town planning ideals coming into the city. And these modernist town planning objectives met the kind of racial segregation objectives and were sort of used to reinforce each other. Black urban dwellers were effectively politically voiceless and landless. And urban residence, particularly for family units, was increasingly restricted. The idea was that migrant laborers, mainly men, but also women, were tolerated and needed for the various economic activities. But the idea of a kind of settled family life was a threat, and that was discouraged. So in this early part of the 20th century, many African workers were accommodated in hostels or barracks or compounds or domestic worker accommodation in private residences. And there was also some municipal provided housing on the urban edge. And then in 1948, the National Party came to power with its particular ideology of separate development and apartheid. And at that time, into the 1950s, there was a strong period of economic growth. And this was the kind of the heyday of the apartheid spatial project. And so between the 1950s and the 1970s was this, again, quite complex set of kind of spatial practices enacted by the National Party government to try and order urban and rural areas in accordance with the ideology. I think what's important to understand is it wasn't only racial separation, but the philosophy of the apartheid government was that ethnicity was also important. And so areas were designated according to tribal or ethnic or language groups as well. And so the belief was that people needed to live with their own kind. And as I say, it wasn't just racial. It fragmented also into these kind of ethnic practices. There were a whole series of legislations. I won't go through all of them, but the Group Areas Act of 1950 is one of the very notorious pieces of legislation, which followed the Population Registration Act, which was to do with registering each person in the population against a particular race group, and then designating where people could live. And forced relocations occurred to move people from a place which was designated for another race group into what had been designated for their race and ethnic group. Mostly all of this was done, enacted on Black people, but also on, to some extent, on the Indian population group and the colored population group. In South Africa, colored is a term for mixed race people with Malay origins, actually. So the state at the time embarked on this massive program of house building, which was to do with the deficits in urban worker accommodation, as well as these plans for spatial ordering. And so huge new neighborhoods were created. These are the very notorious townships of apartheid South Africa, made very famous largely because of this mass production of housing. In fact, about 400,000 units were built between 1950 and 1970. Also, these areas became known as dormitory towns, meaning places for people to sleep, very few associated facilities and amenities, such as recreation or economic activity, very little of that. The idea was you live here and you commute as a laborer into other parts of the city that needed your labor. The bottom left is an image of one of the hostels. So this would be the kind of accommodation built especially to accommodate single-sex workers. They were mainly male hostels, sometimes privately built and owned, associated with the mines or other kinds of manufacturing, sometimes state-built. There were some women's hostels as well, but these were places where families were definitely not allowed, not encouraged, very stark, grim, very bad living conditions, really, really quite inhuman living conditions. So that was kind of the heyday of the big house building program of the 1950s through to the 70s. But by the 70s, things had shifted a bit. First, I'm just showing these maps of Johannesburg. They're really not very clear, but you can see the whole area of Soweto on this left-hand map being created separate from Johannesburg, and then a few patches of townships within the city boundaries of Johannesburg. Really what you see is a kind of patchwork of where different races were designated to live, and that the more central areas and the better areas were for white people, and the peripheral areas were for black people, and the dusty, least hospitable, furthest away, poorly serviced areas were for black people. But with the downturn in the economy into the 1970s, the apartheid state strategy shifted a bit to really focus on rural areas, and this creation of so-called homelands or Bantustans, and these are also ethnically related according to different tribes. So what this map of South Africa shows is the different areas. If you look at the one with little spots in the north part of the country, that is Boputa Tswana for the Tswana people. If you look at the vertical stripes, again in the north part of the country, that is Leboa, and so on. And often these are not contiguous areas of land, very fragmented, very scattered. Separately administered rural areas, claimed by the apartheid government to have the potential to function as independent, separately developed areas that could sustain family life, but in reality extremely impoverished, really quite miserable areas, some of them very, very overcrowded. And that was basically where anyone who didn't have rights to work in an urban area was expected to live, to stay, to try and eke out an existence. But as I say, very little economic activity, very, very impoverished areas. So from the 1970s and into the early 80s, the emphasis in urban areas was really trying to focus just on migrant workers and controlling who had a right through a permit to be in an urban area, and everyone else, women, children, non-workers, needed to stay in these reserves, in these homelands. What happened, of course, with that sort of strategy is that the demand for accommodation in urban areas grew dramatically because the house building program stopped in the 1970s with this new strategy of trying to keep people out of urban areas very strictly. And so people were coming into urban areas. There was demand for housing, and basically the existing housing from the 1950s that got built became very, very overcrowded. There was the start of clandestine sort of informal settlements building, but basically this huge pent-up demand building into the 1980s. And at the same time, apartheid as a policy and as an ideology of the national government was becoming increasingly difficult for them to maintain. They were under a lot of pressure internationally through sanctions. The economy was in a bad way, and there was increasingly more and more violent resistance. And part of that, part of the strategy by the liberation movements into the 1980s was to make urban areas ungovernable. So to really try and take over the townships, push back the state from those areas. And in response to that strategy, government again decided to do a bit of reform, and they tried to promote some home ownership for sort of emerging middle-class Black people with jobs in big corporates and that kind of thing. And that was an attempt to try and sort of stabilize the urban areas. It failed, but that was part of the strategy. But ultimately, the story of the apartheid housing strategy and conditions, I think, is quite nicely summed up by our first post-apartheid housing minister, Joe Slovo. And he said, for Black South Africans under apartheid, housing was about control. It was about excluding people from urban areas. It was about regimentation. It was about the administration of deprivation. And that was his part of his first address to a housing summit in October 1994 after the democratic elections. So I think it's important to sort of understand all of this history and the political potency of the promise of housing that was part of the liberation movement's promise to people that everyone should be able to get a house post-apartheid, and also to understand these decades of housing shortage that happened before 1994, so from the late 1970s onwards, and this kind of pent-up demand, these terrible conditions that people were living in, the deprivation of any urban land, and inability to own land. There were some forms of tenure that allowed long leases, of maybe 30-year lease or that sort of thing, but very little home ownership until that strategy in the 1980s of trying to encourage middle-class people to own houses. So the politics of all of this continues. And I'm now going to be shifting into the transition to democracy in 1994, and I'm trying to give an overview of post-1994, what sort of housing strategy was taken, low-income housing strategy, and why? Why did we end up with what some people would say is something very similar to what the apartheid government was doing in the 1950s and 1960s? I would like to argue it's a bit more, we need to examine it a bit more closely to really pick out the similarities and differences and have this kind of more detailed understanding of what was happening. Okay, so here's our glory moment in 1994, where anything seemed possible, the future seemed bright, a whole set of new policy documents were being drafted and rolled out about how to undo the damage of apartheid, including spatially, including in urban areas, how to restitch the apartheid city from its fragmented and separated nature. We had all those terminologies in our policy documents, and we still do, even though we've failed with many of those. Okay, so this billboard from a road in central Johannesburg is from really quite a long time ago now. It must be 2008, I think. But it encapsulates the sort of vigor of this big housing program that the post-apartheid state embarked upon, and the pride that they felt in rolling out once again new neighborhoods of multiple forms of housing and many units. So it says here 2.7 million houses in 14 years and a total of 13 million people. Now the claim is that over 4 million houses have been delivered since 1994. it constitutes about a quarter of the housing stock of the country. The state subsidized housing program constitutes about a quarter. So it really is enormous in scale. And in fact, what this image shows is two different kinds of post-apartheid housing. In the center image of the billboard are these individual houses for ownership that is the dominant part of our housing program. But in the background, you can see some blocks of flats, blocks of apartments, and there is some of that in our program, but it's numerically very, very small. Apartments for rental. It's a tiny, tiny part of the program. It's maybe 40,000 units, opposed to the 4 million of the standalone individual houses that are shown in the middle of the billboard. So I think part of what we need to understand is how did we get to choose this particular kind of housing program that results in these individual houses in new neighborhoods and often on the edges of cities, but not always, but often on the edges of cities. And in that way, it appears to look very similar to what the apartheid state was doing. So just a few words on how we got here. There was a negotiating forum in 1992 and 1993 that focused on housing. So this was at the same time as the big political negotiations were happening about the nature of a post-apartheid South Africa and how the transition was going to happen. In parallel to that, there was a specific housing forum. So that in itself is highly significant in flagging the political potency of housing, that it needed to be discussed and negotiated. And all the political parties were there, including the apartheid government, the National Party, big business, organized labor, the banks, the financial institutions. Everybody was there debating what form should housing take. And the general consensus at the end of all of this is that what was adopted didn't actually suit anybody. It didn't fall with any of the negotiating positions. It was a compromise, and maybe quite a problematic compromise. So what was adopted was basically a site and service scheme with a very basic starter house. I think I might have an image of that, perhaps this image on the left, a very basic unit, and people were expected to complete the housing themselves, add on rooms, put in windows, finish the roof, but government would give you a plot of land for ownership and services, waterborne sanitation, water, electricity in some cases, and you would complete the rest of it. So the question might be asked, why did this negotiating forum end up going for this kind of a model and not go for the multi-story apartment type model? We already know that South African cities are very low density and sprawling, and all of the policy documents are saying from the planning perspective, we need to compact, we need to densify, we need to make better use of existing infrastructure, not do additional neighborhoods on the peripheries of our cities, which is what we have done. So surely it would make sense to go for apartments and to go for rental accommodation in well-located parts of the city, close to job opportunities, close to facilities and amenities. And there was a very strong lobby that was pushing for that. And some of that was supported by ANC members, African National Congress members, who themselves have been in exile in places like Eastern Europe and had seen this sort of housing and lived in it and thought that that's what we should go for. But there are two main explanations as to why we didn't end up going for that. One was a financial explanation. There was a lot of concern that the apartheid government had bankrupted the state, that there was very little money left, a lot of uncertainty about what the story actually was. But people at this forum were persuaded that the post-apartheid government would have money for a capital subsidy, that is to actually build the units or buy the land and put in the infrastructure. But it then needed to hand over responsibility for running costs to the actual people living in the housing. It did not have money, so the argument went, to actually subsidize rental or to have any ongoing responsibility for buildings year after year after year. And so this idea of a once-off subsidy, a once-off capital subsidy, was the one that held sort of financial strength in these negotiations. Perhaps a second reason was to do with this political story, and it was about the emotional and psychological importance of land ownership, and of transferring land to people who had not ever been able to own land in an urban area. Even if it was just a small portion of land that was being transferred, this was highly significant to people who had been denied that right for decades and decades. So the approach was adopted of these starter houses that people then add onto, and it became part of this reconstruction and development program of the ANC government, which this RDP had many different aspects to it. This was a big socio-economic program, but the housing part of it was significant. And in fact, these words RDP are now the nickname for the housing. It's known as RDP housing. So this housing delivery then started vigorously in the 1990s. Developers got involved, the state got involved, and basically there was a big push to deliver the numbers and to develop houses. And it was responding to very real needs in the country. People were living in really basic, very, very dire conditions. You were hearing about people moving into their first house from very rudimentary shack settlements, very overcrowded, desperately overcrowded old apartheid housing from townships, and even sort of living in the bush and then moving into these houses. So there was also really a sense of desperation and of really need, and housing was one of the things that could be delivered relatively quickly. Things could be built, the ribbon could be cut, the keys could be handed over to somebody, whereas perhaps transforming the health system, transforming the education system were quite complex, longer-term processes that had to unfold. But going and building something and giving it to people was politically very, very powerful, a powerful instrument. So, as I say, the early generation housing produced these very basic structures that people were supposed to finish themselves. But anecdotally, the state was hearing criticism from people. People were taunting the state and saying Mandela's houses are worse than Verwoerd's. Verwoerd being the one of the high apartheid presidents from the National Party, synonymous with apartheid, and people were saying, but look, Mandela's delivering houses that are smaller and less finished and less complete than Verwoerd was doing. And so what happened was a push by government to specify a certain square meterage and a certain type of materials. It moved away from the starter house idea and the sort of site and service kind of idea, and it started delivering these bigger, more complete houses in order to say we are better than the apartheid state. We can deliver better things. So what does this program deliver? Well, it's the kind of detached house usually that's seen in that picture, but it does actually take many different forms. There are sometimes units. It can look quite different across the country. There are different people involved in sort of the design of it, but it delivers this ownership, this piece of land, this house, and the infrastructure that goes with it, and it does that to qualifying beneficiaries. And you qualify if you as a household, which means you and your spouse, earn less than a very low amount of money. So you can be indigent, you can have naught money, you can be entirely dependent on some form of social grant from the state. The state does have some social grants, but they're quite limited, and you will still qualify for a house. In other words, you can be given a house whilst at the same time having no discernible means of actually sustaining yourself there, no discernible means of maintaining the house or anything like that, because you are so poor, you're in effect indigent. So this is not the kind of program that other places have. Mexico, for example, I think it's much more to the working poor that the houses get delivered. This is to the poorest of the poor. and it's an ever-expanding group of people, and the housing program is kind of stuck 30 years later, never being able to satisfy all the people that qualify for it, and there's still a very long waiting list. Just a word on the image on the bottom right. These multi-story units are part of a more recent phase of housing development, and it's responding to criticisms about the low density nature of the previous forms of housing. But these are still free giveaway flats, and they're highly problematic in their own way, very limited management and oversight and maintenance. So I'm personally very against this kind of 3-4 story walk up because of the way it's being delivered and the lack of long-term thinking about what's going to happen to these kinds of buildings. Maybe also just to say, in the early days of the housing projects, they were mainly these big neighborhoods for quite a homogenous income group. But there was a criticism that the state was creating ghettos of very poor people, and there's now been a shift into mixed income development with a little bit of state rental housing, ownership for the poorest of the poor, but also people who are buying mortgage housing, and the state is working with developers in quite complex models of financing these kind of new developments. So most of that housing was happening in the peripheries of cities, but not all. So this is an image I took in Durban, and you can see on the slope up there some units that have been built in what was an informal settlement in very close to a sort of white neighborhood. And there were these kind of pockets of infill development happening, but mostly it's been quite peripheral. So this map on the left, all these black areas show the main housing projects. You can see patches of them in the south of the city, but again, that's kind of in the mining belt or down towards Soweto. Otherwise, it's largely peripheral, but not all of them. The little map on the right does show some more central types of projects and smaller infill developments that do try and do something to undo the apartheid city. But the big pressure for delivery resulted in peripheral projects that do arguably extend the city and create all sorts of problems for city government. How have people responded to these? Well, just at a quite a basic level, there's lots of transformation of the houses going on. People are changing them, people are adding rooms, people are running businesses in them, although none of that is planned by the state, and it's often not welcomed by the state at all. They want people to live in these units and go and commute to a job at the same time as there are no jobs. So lots of contradictions, and there's quite a thriving market of people buying and selling the houses, sometimes improved units for quite a lot of money. And there's a lot of online trade of the housing going on. That's not really permitted by the state at all. You certainly aren't allowed to sell your house for 8 years. You have to hold on to it. But there's a lot of illicit and informal trade that is going on and that is not being registered in terms of the formal land legal systems. Just to make the point about the peripheral development, I've zoomed back to a map of the province as a whole, and the blue spots are where the big housing developments are planned, and the red spots, I hope it's coming out like that for you, is the number of businesses per square kilometer. So it's basically just showing housing usually being located in places far from economic activity, which is one of the big criticisms of the South African housing program, that it's often not connected to economic areas of activity. It's very poorly serviced by transport, often no official public transport provided at all, but those minibus taxis that I showed earlier, the informal transport kind of picks up the gap. But yeah, and in this way, they are criticized as being potentially kind of seas of poverty that are being created by the state. And yet here we are. Here's an official document from the Department of Human Settlements, National Department of Human Settlements, celebrating 20 years of human settlements. So this would have been in 2014. And here is this reference back to the Freedom Charter, and it's bringing the Freedom Charter to life. It's fulfilling that promise that was in the Freedom Charter of houses, security, and comfort for all. So that's the end of part 2, and I'm horribly aware that I'm way over time and I haven't started part 3. So let me hear from Paula and Amanda what I should do at this point.
We are a little bit shocked of how the construction looked like our My House, My Life program, federal one. So we were like, oh, yours like to be São Paulo. So we were like, wow, here.
Okay.
Questions, people?
Are the houses government built, or they are like subsidized or private?
So the houses that government builds are fully subsidized, so they're entirely paid for by the state. The person who receives the house doesn't have to pay anything at all, nothing. In the early parts of the program, there was this idea that people should contribute, but that fell away very quickly, and government basically pays for the whole thing.
Sarah,
It's a gift.
1,600 houses in the peripheral area, or was this map that you showed only a point that is at the center of a city? I don't know. Maybe.
So I think I showed a map that showed some planned housing projects, many of which haven't actually happened, but there are a lot of them in peripheral areas. Why it's a little bit confusing is there's a particular settlement that I've done research in, which is on the western edge of Soweto, the far edge of Soweto, away from Johannesburg, away from the economic action. And it's got farmland and mining land around it. And it does not comply with what the spatial planners say are the areas where housing investment should go. So it contradicts that. The spatial planners are saying they've identified priority areas close to transport, close to economic activity, and this is where the housing should be going. And yet here's this project that does the opposite. And the explanation for that is partly that the provincial level of government is pushing some of these housing projects. Now, the provincial level of government is responding to pressure from the neighboring municipalities, and for them, clinging onto the outside edge of Johannesburg is better than where they are. So the province is pushing the city to agree to some of these peripheral developments. And what is further confusing about it is that private developers work with government to create these mixed income developments, and they are selling on the open market these entry-level first-time homeowner mortgage housing. And there's a big market for it in the place where the planners and the geographers are saying this shouldn't be happening, this is a bad place. But people are buying there. Now, are they buying there because that's the only place that they can afford in these peripheral areas and they can't afford a better location? So now you have this very complex picture of people buying in and the state, and that reinforces and gives the state confidence that it's doing the right thing. You academics can criticize us for putting the housing on the edge, but look, people are buying, they're putting their own money into these places. So the picture becomes very complicated, and it's underpinned by a complex land story of who owns land and who's pushing to make certain pieces of land available for development because it suits them as well.
How were the families chosen to be beneficiaries of the program? And are there any studies about the displacement of them? Like, where were they living before? And do they have to move
Across kilometers to
receive
the
a
new
house? And
Sorry, Amanda, I didn't actually hear that very well. I didn't catch the question very well.
Oh my God, no, I'm too close now. I was wondering, how were the families chosen to be beneficiaries of the program? And if there's any studies about the relocation of the families, if they were leaving far away from these peripheral areas and they had to move to receive the houses? And also, I don't know if this is maybe going too far, how much would it cost for them to finish the project? Because they received the houses, but I understand that firstly they weren't finished. So there was a cost involved in moving into these places. So 3 questions.
So on the second question, what was the cost of finishing? I haven't actually seen any studies that have looked at that. It was such a brief period in the 90s that required that kind of input. And I should do some research because I was connected to one of the projects. I was a municipal official in the 90s in Durban, and I should go and do some research in one particular project. But on your second question, how are people chosen? People register their interest for housing, and in effect, it translates into a very long waiting list. It's supposed to be more sophisticated than that. It's supposed to try to match people to housing that's closer to where their kids are in school or where they have a job or whatever. But in effect, it isn't really very nuanced in that way. And what tends to happen is people have waited so long to get a house that if they're offered a house in a location that doesn't suit them, they take it anyway because they fear they might never get another chance. And perhaps some of those people rent out that accommodation or even sell it. In my own research, I came across several people who were not living in their housing because it didn't work for them. The kids went to stay with a granny somewhere because it was closer to school. They couldn't afford to commute from where the house was to school. Other people in the family were living somewhere else, but they were holding on to the house for sometimes for a kind of for hope that the future might be different, that there might be a time when we are all able to live together in this house. It may in the future provide a platform for future life improvement. And in my third part, which I think we might not have time to get onto, I've got a few quotes from people kind of saying, I'm not sure what to think about the housing because I'm not sure if it is good for me or it's bad for me because I can't live there, I can't afford to commute from there. So these kind of complex patterns. But at the same time, you will also, and my own research has in some of these areas, you get people responding enormously positively. And I'm so grateful to government for having given me this house. It's provided dignity in my life. It's done everything for me. So a very mixed picture of responses to how it's playing out.
It has a lot of contradictions there, you know? And
yeah,
I would like to two questions to move around a little bit from housing to water. And the pictures that you showed, they were without pavement and the streets. How is it about water and sewage? So constructing so far and extending the city, how does the services, the public services, are they going? How do they manage that? I'd like for you to talk a little bit about that. And you could also, in Brazil, when we had this huge, massive housing program, the excuse was to have economic development and to generate employment, jobs. And how is it about? Because your gender lens, they have everything to do with this unemployment situation. So I'd like to hear a little bit about that.
So on the first question, there are some projects that have been developed in the country. There are some neighborhoods of houses that have been developed without the services that there should be, and that's scandalous. It's to do with corruption, but you will find examples of housing projects where there is a flush toilet inside, but the sewer network has not actually been built. But it's supposed to be there. And so in the properly functioning projects, all of that infrastructure is there. mostly waterborne sewerage, not always, and sometimes generally tarred roads with proper stormwater. And certainly the area of the country I was living in as a municipal official had a lot of rainfall and very steep topography, and the municipality required very high specification public infrastructure that it was going to inherit and have to maintain. And the individual house will have a water supply and an electricity supply generally. There's supposed to be a program where people pay for utilities, pay for services. That's not really happening. People aren't paying, and the state has kind of lost control over that part of it. So it's a bit of a sad situation. On the story of unemployment and men, so my third part sort of focuses on that, and I haven't got to that yet. So I'm not sure if there's time for me to show any of that, or if you want to do another session another time, or what. I should go ahead with that third part. Oh, sorry, Paula, I can't hear you.
Yes,
sorry.
I'm sorry. I was. We have more 22 minutes. If you could show the agenda.
Okay.
Nice.
Yes. Okay. I'll proceed with that. Let me just do my sharing of slides. Okay, so let me see what I can cover in about 15 minutes or so. Right, so this third part of the presentation, I'm turning to some analysis from a gendered perspective. And the focus that I'm taking this afternoon is on men. But I think, and I hope it comes from research that is inspired by feminist methods in some sense, in the sense of privileging lived experiences, the voices of people being researched, respecting domestic and household encounters with infrastructure. So in my mind, I'm drawing on some of the feminist approaches to doing the research, but the focus is, in this particular case, on men. And I think this is quite an under-researched aspect of housing in South Africa. The housing program itself, the state's housing program, explicitly supports prioritizing women-headed households. And that is, I think, arguably a very progressive intervention that has been embedded in the housing program for maybe 15 years or so. But it nevertheless has consequences for male recipients, and there is a whole lot of complexity that comes with all of that. But because the impacts on men of the housing program were understudied, my colleague Paula Meth, who some of you will know, and I did a little bit of research in this, and it's that angle that I'm going to take today. And I think part of what's interesting is the complex story of masculinity in a context of unemployment and of no social benefit for unemployed people in South Africa. So I mentioned that there are social grants, but it's a limited form. There's an old age grant, and there's a child support grant, and there's a disability grant, but there's no unemployment benefit. And if you are a man of employable age or a woman of employable age, there isn't really any support for you if you can't get a job. You have to find a way through life. And what ends up happening is the literature talks a lot about the inability to transition to life stages of adulthood, because you cannot you cannot find a home of your own. You cannot pay some of the family payments required. So there's practices of bride price, paying the family of the person that you want to marry, paying for a child that's born out of wedlock, a lot of sort of customary practices that are bound up in the ability to kind of achieve the markers of adulthood. And if you are financially not able to achieve any of those, then you kind of get stuck in this stage of not achieving. And that has big impacts on masculinity and how masculinity is understood and how it is felt by people, and the social ills that result from that, in terms of things like domestic violence, alcohol and drug abuse, and things like that. So I think there's a whole bunch of reasons why it's quite significant to look at the story of men in relation to housing. So what Paul Lemeth and I did is combine our two pieces of research that had focused on the state housing program to look particularly at what men were saying about having received a government subsidized house. And what was quite interesting for us is this quote on the right-hand side. This comes from Nelson Mandela in his own sort of memoir, the famous book, The Long Walk to Freedom. And the quote is, "It was the opposite of grand, but it was my first true home of my own. I was mightily proud. A man is not a man until he has a house of his own." Now, obviously, this kind of thing is playing into a very, into gender stereotypes, into a very patrimonial kind of society, and that has a whole set of other consequences. But it's quite powerful in the way that it plays out in men's contemporary understanding of the need for a home and to be able to achieve a home. So just to go into quickly some of these research findings. There was a set of findings that spoke about impacts on identity and dignity. And this is kind of following that same quote from Nelson Mandela. "If you are a man and staying in Mjondolo, which is the name for the shack or the shanty town, you feel hopeless, no dignity even to your family. Since I've received this house, I have the dignity." So here are a series of quotes. I won't go through all of them, but these are all from men who have received a government house, comparing their life before and their life now, and particularly these impacts on identity and their sense of self through achieving a sort of decent housing and a house that they could then call their own and claim their own. Then also there were a set of findings on the impact on interpersonal relationships. And I have to say at this point, what we conclude from the research is that some of this is not specific to men. It also is the same with women, but there are some men-specific responses to having received state housing. And so this interpersonal relationships, this is also to do with being able to achieve a level of privacy, also areas where things like homework can be done, also feeling that you can have visitors, you can have family to visit, rather than sort of feel what some people describe as the shame of living in the shanty town beforehand. Then other kinds of pressure and impacts that are not so positive. So it may be that the house becomes a basis for being able to generate income, and for someone who's unemployed, that's very, very significant. For example, to be able to rent out a room or to create a business. But in other ways, it may be that the house itself impedes income generation. So as I was saying just now about some of these peripheral developments and people not actually being able to live in the house on a daily basis because it's too far away, there were really quite poignant examples of that of that happening in this research. So this is a map. It's very blurred for some reason, but all that dotted line is showing is that somebody was working in the central part of Johannesburg as a basic street trader and had received a house way to the south of the city, right on the municipal boundary, and was not able to live in that house because the cost of commuting was just too high. So there's this particular man saying, I don't know what to say about the government's program. I wanted a place to say I'm suffering, but I don't know. I don't know what to say because I'm still sleeping in the street, even though I now am a homeowner. And also, of course, in the eyes of the state, this person would be a homeowner. They would be registered as having received a house, but government would not be associating that home ownership with somebody who's sleeping on the streets. They would not be seeing this contradiction that's coming out of the way in which people are having to engage with their housing. So I suppose what I'm saying here is that in the findings of what it means for men to receive the house, there were these contradictions coming through, some positive and strongly positive sort of things being said, some quite confused, ambivalent, and some negative things being said. But this person, another person who was not living in the house every day because it was too far away, was still saying, nevertheless, because I've got a house, I'm free. Because we've got our own house, no one can ever take it away from me. No one can ever evict me from it. So, you know, this was me as an interviewer really trying to understand in what way was this house performing any positive function in this person's life, because they couldn't live there. But they were saying it is important. It represents freedom. It represents independence. And that itself is so valuable. Then other kinds of impacts that were coming out of the research to do with the new identity of being consumers. And some of that is to do with negative pressure of feeling the need to buy furniture, buy a TV, because now you had a house, you needed to be able to furnish it. If you were going to be able to invite people, or family wanted to come and see where you were living, you needed to be able to show things inside the house as well. So people spoke about the pressure and of this. And by the way, maybe just to mention that some of the method for this particular research was diaries, people writing diaries about their feelings about their house, which is proving to be a very positive, powerful way in which one can actually get sentiments to be expressed, often more intimate sentiments expressed in the diary than expressed in interviews. But someone else saying, yes, it's positive to be able to buy these consumer goods because now they're not going to be damaged in the rain the way they were in the shack. So I'm just quickly whipping through these different kinds of sentiments to do with men's experiences of receiving the housing. And some of this is to do with this pressure and positive pressure and some very negative sort of pressure. This particular person wrote in his diary about specifically the gendered tensions and what he called the violence between families caused by the houses. So this is really illuminating. So there he was saying he's witnessing people fighting within the household about the house. When people were living in the shack, there was sort of nothing to fight over in terms of the actual accommodation itself. But in living in the house, it became a source of tension about who it really belonged to, who owned it. Sometimes what you have is the state insisting that both the man and the woman's names are registered on the title deeds, but the actual domestic situation means that the one chases the other out. Usually the man chases the woman out. She's now registered as having had a house and can't ever get another one, but the domestic violence has erupted around the issue of the house. So very complex sets of things coming through in terms of the impacts of having received a state house. Yeah, so just to make the point that not all of these impacts and experiences are particular to men, but some of them were particular to men. And really what it was illuminating is the multiple dimensions of housing that a gendered lens helps reveal and helps bring out. Some very complex things that really just point to the importance of doing more of this research in the South African context, because it's a very under-researched sort of area. I'm just going to quickly go on in the last few minutes to talk about the other piece of research, which is with people who had not received any housing. So these are what the average person in the street and government would call homeless people. They are living in parks, in empty space, sleeping under a bush. And this piece of research involved a group of men who themselves had been homeless as the interviewers. So this is them on the left-hand side. And we had been involved in a project previously, writing a book, and they had been involved in making a movie about coming to Johannesburg and living on the streets of Johannesburg. And we then worked together to interview people living rough, living unsheltered. And what was really poignant about this research for me was some of the reasons why people were living in this kind of homeless state. And the perception of the average person in Johannesburg is that this is a social dropout, somebody who's dealing with social ills, perhaps difficulties such as mental health difficulties or substance abuse, or they've dropped out of society. What the research showed was a whole lot of people who did not fit into that profile at all. But these were people who were choosing to minimize their living costs as much as possible by living in public space clandestinely, in order that they could then try and save money for other kinds of things. And predominantly it was men that were living like this. And predominantly what they were talking about is the need to support family and children living in elsewhere, in a rural area or in a small urban place. And for some of these men, they did not ever anticipate living rough like this. They thought they would be able to find accommodation, but the cost of accommodation in Johannesburg was too high. The cost of transport to take them from where they could find accommodation to where they were trying to earn an income was too high. And then many of these people had no formal, stable jobs, but had very low and insecure and fluctuating earnings. A short period of employment for 1 or 2 weeks on a construction site, or offering their services as someone who can paint or do hardware or building skills, but it would just be a few hours here and there. And this very insecure and fluctuating earnings meant that they couldn't actually sustain a rental of accommodation. So all of this fits into this picture of high unemployment, but also the expectations on men to be providers for family. So here are the quotes where people are saying, the money that I can save, I send home, I send it to the children, I send it to my wife, or whatever it is. I'm struggling here so that I can try and support people elsewhere. So really kind of contradicting the picture of social dropouts and really inverting that into people, into a story of people taking responsibility and trying to fulfill expectations, but being pigeonholed by society as something totally different. And definitely concealing these circumstances from their family, not wanting people to know that they're living in the park, maybe telling their family that they're living somewhere else in the city, but they're living like that in order to send the money home. So I thought it was really interesting with this particular piece of research to the expectations on men to perform a particular role for family was translating into these kinds of living circumstances. They themselves were concealing these circumstances from family, and they were definitely being seen by surrounding property owners and the state as vagrants, as people who had fallen out of society. But a very different picture was kind of emerging from this. And these are sometimes people who would not qualify for the government housing because they are cross-border migrants, maybe people from Mozambique or Zimbabwe or Lesotho. So that might be one reason why they couldn't get a government housing, or they are somewhere on the waiting list, but the waiting list is so long, it's so many years before getting a house, that this is the kind of circumstances that people are staying in. So that is a very quick taste of that sort of lens on men and housing.
Thank you, Sarah. Very, very nice, your last part of the presentation. Any questions?
been a long session. I'm sure everyone is very tired and needs a break.
A break, but one comment, and I don't know if you noticed, this course we have always read gender lens as women lens, and she's bringing men's lens, how informing, it's part of its fight and everything. But another thing that I would like to comment is the methodology of using diaries as a way of getting close to this ideas. You know, that's very important because we after break we will discuss about how they will interview people, how they will bring some life trajectory for us to. So it is also one good idea to bring to the discussion.
I thought it was very precious how you showed us 3 different scales: the urban planning scale, the housing scale, and the personal scale of the people that are living in this houses and the people that don't have access to these houses. So I think we got a very complete panorama. I don't know if I can say that, but it's very interesting to see, and I'm very in awe of all the similarities. I think we commented that a lot during your presentation, and it's very, very similar to what we have here in terms of segregation, even though we didn't have an apartheid state installed, institutionalized. We can see that in our urban spaces, and the housing situation is very similar. And just thank you very much. It was very precious.
Thanks, Amanda. That's really interesting. And I would very much like to come back and come and visit some of these projects and come and hear and learn about the situation there. That would be absolutely fascinating.
They are inviting you to come to Brazil, Sarah.
I'll come. Yeah.
Maybe Portuguese sometime.
I must learn some Portuguese.
So thank you, Sarah. Thank you again and again. And we'll do a break. We keep in touch. We'll do a break, and we're very happy to have you here again. And
thank you. Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Amanda. It was a great pleasure. I thank you for the invitation.
Amanda now is working on this class also with me, and we're making jokes like she's a feminist now. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Bye, everybody. Bye. Obrigada.